Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the How-To Academy. My name is David Malone, and this evening I have the great pleasure of talking to Professor Robert Sapolsky. Good evening, Robert.
Good morning, where I am. Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Professor Sapolsky is Professor of Biology and Neurology at Stanford and wrote that book, a big fat book. And what's rather amazing about it is he set out to venture into the battleground that's been raging for hundreds of years between Rousseau and Hobbes. Are we dreadful people or are we lovely people? And what I found most impressive about the book, Robert, is that you didn't dodge any of the very difficult, thorny, vexed sort of political implications. But at the same time, I don't think in any of the 600 pages, you ever gave anyone a simple or pat answer.
Well, thanks. This reflects many, many decades on my part of coming to terms with there is no answer and there is no clear path, and this science stuff is confusing as hell at times.
You call it the biology of humans at our best and worst. And the structure of the book is really unusual. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I would say the two themes that run through it, the first one being why best and worst, is like this incredibly puzzling thing about us as a species. We are, without question, the most miserably violent species on Earth. And at the same time, we are also, without question, the most cooperative and the most altruistic and the most self-sacrificial. And the huge puzzle is to understand how we can be at both extremes, and most importantly, how it can involve the exact same behavior. If you want to explain the behavior of like how your brain told your finger to pull the trigger on that gun, that's completely trivial and boring. The biology of the context of it is what's challenging, because in one setting, you do that with your finger and pull a trigger, and it's the most appalling act imaginable. And in another setting, you do the exact same thing. And if you are sacrificially drawing fire on yourself to save innocent people, it's wondrous. And the biology of making sense of us is over and over and over the biology of context. And you can't make sense of anything we do outside of the context and outside of the context of everything that has gone into bringing us to that moment.
And in many ways, that runs counter to a lot of the more popular books, say, of the last 10 years. I mean, as a neurologist, also I have to explain to people that Robert is sitting in front of, is that a brain scan or?
It is something called Brainbow, which was invented by two Harvard neuroanatomists, an incredibly clever idea by which you do some genetic manipulation in a mouse, and as a result, every single neuron in that brain is a different color. So this is my favorite part of the brain behind me, the hippocampus, that I spent decades dwelling in. And I think this is just like the most beautiful thing on earth, showing that, like many scientists, I should get outside more often.
Yeah, as you say, context is a word that you use all the time in the book. You seem to eschew saying, look, it's genes which cause it, or it's your childhood which causes it. In a way, the book is as much, seems to me to be advocating a way of thinking.
Well, the basic structure, which you noted, reflects that. So one of our behaviors occurs, it's wonderful, it's horrific, it's ambiguously somewhere in between in the eye of the beholder. And, you know, we ask the typical question, why did that person do that just now? And what the book is about is, if you really want to get an inkling of the answer to that, you have to take into account what went on in that person's brain 1 second before. Which areas are involved in fear, anxiety, empathy, disgust, etc. But once you figured that out, you also have to ask what went on in that environment a minute before, which made those neurons in that part of the brain activate the way they did. And you also have to ask what went on in the hours to days before, hormone levels, which will affect how sensitive those neurons are to those stimuli. And before you know it, you're saying what went on in the previous half dozen months in terms of neural plasticity, the fact that experience, extremes of experience, completely change our brains. And then you're back to adolescence and some critical brain construction you did then, back to childhood, something that still catches people off guard, back to your fetal life, because you spent 9 months having environment influencing how your brain was being put together then, back to when you were nothing other than genes. And at that point, the really big leap is back to what kind of culture your ancestors came up with, because that influenced how you were mothered within minutes of birth, what sort of ecosystems give rise to certain types of cultures, and eventually at the bottom of the barrel, how we evolved as a species that gives us certain predispositions and such. And what you get is, if you think you can explain our behavior with here is the gene or the neurotransmitter or the childhood trauma or the, you are going to be blinded, because every single one of those steps where we are right now is the end product of every one of those prior influences. And all of those are in context dependent ways. What do these genes do? It depends what the environment is. What's the effect of raising this hormone level? It depends on what the social setting is, and so on. It's all contextual, and it's all the outcome of the sum of our biology.
I mean, one of the things then that view really runs counter to is the sort of the popular, well, there's a gene for that. It's the biological equivalent of, well, there's an app for that.
Yes, yes. You know, we live in the genomics era. You can have somebody's genome sequenced for them as a birthday present. The human, it's the code of codes. It's the holy grail. You get these molecular fundamentalists who get all sort of glazed at that point in terms of how wondrous this is. And the reality amid this view that genes are running our cells and our organs and our selves as well, and that they're responsible for everything, genes have no idea what they're doing. Saying a gene knows what it's doing is like saying that the recipe in a cookbook decides whether or not you're going to make this type of cake or that type for the holidays. All it is a readout. All it is an instruction manual for putting together different types of proteins. And what is it that's deciding when genes are activated or not? Your environment. And different environments do very, very different things to genes. Genes, there's nothing about genes when it comes to our behavior, or virtually nothing, that's about inevitabilities. It's all potentials, vulnerabilities, proclivities, and so on.
Yeah, you tackle in a couple of places the whole business about twins, that people love to say, oh, well, they're identical twins, and so the genes will do this and the genes will do that. I actually, 2 of my sons are identical twins. So I've always looked at them and go, they're not running the way the textbook says they ought to,
Exactly. And the textbooks are not running the way the old textbooks used to either. Okay, identical twins, a starting point of this whole field of behavior genetics that's been around since like Galton eyeing how heavy cows were at some like fair in the English countryside. Behavior genetics, one of its like poster child approaches is looking at twins, comparing identical twins with dizygotic fraternal twins of the same sex, and with a simple concept in there, which is identical twins are genetically identical. So if there's any trait about them that they tend to have more in common than you see in fraternal twins, it's due to the shared genes. And the problems with that are enormous, and you no doubt know them inside out in terms of identical twins are raised in more similar environments as are fraternal twins. And that's a huge chunk of it. But one of the most striking parts of it is you're an identical twin and you've got the exact same genes as your sibling there, and you're sitting there in the womb, and there's different types of placental circulation for identical twins that will determine how similar or different hormone levels you're being exposed to from mom, nutrient levels, things of that sort, and the degree of shared bloodstream in identical twin fetuses is a predictor of the degree of shared IQ at a later point. Environment. By the time identical twins are born, you take like white blood cells and you look at not the genetics of those cells, but the epigenetics, how environment has altered the regulation. And at the moment of birth, they are already epigenetically different, and it's just like more divergence from there. Twins, adoption studies, etc., have been the backbone of the erroneous view that our universe is centered around genes and our behavioral insights require them to play a central dominant role, and it's simply not the case.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of that you look at in every single chapter seems, it sort of says, look, yes, there's information running from genes to the organism, but it's very much, you're at pains to say, look, the flow of information in biology runs the other way. You get the flow of information from the cell to the genes, from outside the cell into the cell, from the environment of a creature back to the creature. And there's a sort of a reversal of that sort of reductionistic notion that it all comes from the smallest, most profound, simple thing.
If nothing else that we have learned is reductionism was pretty good at like ushering in the Enlightenment, and reductionism is pretty good for making vaccines and things like that. When you want to understand complex stuff like our cells, our brains, our societies, you can only get so far breaking them down into their component parts, and believe that if you've studied every itty bitty little sub-component part, all you have to do is add them together and you have explanatory power. And instead you got non-linear, chaotic, emergent properties, which are where things are at. The metaphor that I like the most about that is reductive science has taught us how to fix a clock that doesn't work. And I have no idea how modern ones do, but you got an old one like from 10 years ago and it runs on gears or something and it stops working. And what do? You take it apart and you take all the parts out and all the gears and you find the one gear thing with a tooth broken and you fix it and you put all the pieces back together and the clock runs now. You've solved it with reductionism, having like a ceremony where you waved like goat intestines over the watch was not going to solve it. So hooray for modern science, all of that. But what we're much more about is, instead of when you have a clock that isn't running, you have a cloud that isn't raining, there's a drought, whatever. How do you fix that? You don't solve that by dividing the cloud in half and studying each half and then developing another specialty that divides each half in half. And when you finally have enough people who've gotten theses on cloud subparts, you add them all together and you now know we're clouds, we're not clocks. We are emergent, non-linear, complex creatures where you can only get so far with reductionism, which is not to say that you give up on science at that point. You come in with an equally rigorous, equally deterministic type of science that just happens to be very, very different for thinking about complicated things.
How have you found the reaction to your book? Because there are still an awful lot of reductionists out there in universities.
Well, I think, unless you get a really hardcore genetic determinist in the halls of academia these days, like everybody knows, genes are interacting with environment. It ultimately makes no sense to ask what a gene does, what it does in a particular environment. And along with that comes sort of the caveat that anything you can say about what a gene does is only based on the environments in which you have studied it already. And the more environments in which you study something, the more different influences you can detect that nobody knew was there before. All you can do by studying genes in an increasing number of environments is decreasing the seemingly autonomous power of genes. So there's not a whole lot of academics sort of who are horrified by that. They mostly roll their eyes at why I would want to spend my time not only thinking about reductive genes. My lab used to like build artificial genes and stick them into brain cells of rats and do cool stuff at that point. But why, I think it's important to also be talking to sociologists about understanding like the biology of behavior as well. Where I get the biggest pushback is not the people who have been convinced to think about life and biology being deterministic, but have gotten gummed up with, and reductionism is the only deterministic model to deal with. They're okay. The much bigger one, and this is what I'm lecturing to non-scientists, is people who are not thinking in terms of a deterministic universe, emergent or reductive or whatever. People who somewhere in there will admit, yes, we're biological organisms. And like if you gravely damage somebody's frontal cortex, you will get all sorts of violations of social norms, which indicate in some way that this is a broken neurological machine rather than somebody with a lousy soul. But they are effortlessly able to be compatibilists, that they can have we are biological organisms, yet somehow, somewhere, there is still room to see free will floating around in there, and thus responsibility, and thus agency. And those are the folks I think who get most distressed by, if you spend enough time studying the neurobiology behavior and the endocrinology and the genetics and the cultural and blah, 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 all of that, free will looks like a really suspect concept coming out the other end. And I have been so struck by how many people get like deeply rattled by this when they are confronted, because it's not an easy thing to accept.
But are people saying that they object to any notion that we're a biological machine? Or are they just saying, well, we might be a biological machine, but it doesn't matter. I mean, we're not constrained in any way. What's been the nature of the pushback?
There's this sort of magical thinking, and I'm not trying to sound too snarky here about it, but in being able to say, yes, we are the sum of our neurons, which are the sum of their proteins, which are the sum of et cetera, all the way down, yet somewhere in there, there's room for a non-deterministic, non-materialistic explanation of things like consciousness and religiosity and aesthetics. And somewhere in the back door in is going to creep the notion that, and we also have agency. We have control over all of these processes, and there is free will lurking in there. And by now I've got this very sarcastic sort of riff on, I have read more papers by more philosophers, contemporary philosophers, that essentially can be reduced down to 3 sentences. First sentence, wow, neuroscience, there's been so many advances in neuroscience, isn't that cool? Sentence number 2, some of these new insights challenge our very notions of us as having agency and responsibility, and the very notion of how we think about ourselves as humans, and punishment and praise and reward and blame and all of that. Sentence 3, nah, not really. And somehow at the breach say, but yet there's an essence of us somewhere lurking in there that can't be solely the outcome of all of this biology stuff. Insanely complicated biology that interacts with culture and history and literature and who knows what else, but nonetheless, all we are nothing more or less than the organic material obeying the laws of the physical universe that make us up. And people get really unsettled at that point in many, many cases.
Well, let's tackle some of the unsettling things that you do look at. thinking again of context, one of the things that you say is when people talk about aggression and the biology of aggression and are we aggressive or aren't we, and what makes us aggressive, and you say at some point, look, when we're talking about aggression, what we really ought to be talking about is fear, and the biology of fear.
And the most clear-cut way of making that obvious is you take this part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala, it's right next door to the hippocampus in my background. It's nowhere near as interesting, but nonetheless, we have an amygdala, and the amygdala is about aggression. You electrically stimulate the amygdala in a human, in a monkey, in a lab rat, you will get unprovoked aggression. You surgically destroy the amygdala, you get just the opposite. The amygdala is about aggression, it's about aggression. Sit down your average amygdalologist who's just spent 40 years studying that part of the brain, and you ask them to sum up what the amygdala is about in one word, and the majority of them are not going to say aggression, they're going to say fear. The amygdala is about fear. It's about the fears that you didn't have to learn, the hardwired ones. It's about the fears that you had to be taught. Who is scary? Who's not an us? Based on experience, based on observation, all of that. And it's the world of anxiety, things where your body is acting as if there is a legitimately fear-evoking thing going on, and it's not really there. And instead, you are perceiving threats where other people don't. The amygdala is all about fear and anxiety. In other words, you cannot begin to understand the neurobiology of organisms being crappy and injurious to each other outside the context of organisms feeling threatened and unsafe. In a world in which no amygdaloid neuron need be afraid, we'd all be sleeping with lions and lambs and that sort of thing. It's utterly intertwined. And if you want to make sense of humans at their worst, at their ugliest, at their most heartless, at their most parochial and sectarian and all of those things, you can't make any sense of it out of the context of things like fear. And I think that explains a huge amount of some political tumult that goes on in the world.
Yeah, so I mean, in some ways, rather than say, we're naturally aggressive, would it be more accurate to say, look, we're naturally given to being frightened?
We're naturally to doing all those things. And we're naturally to doing those. Here's sort of one way that I sort of think about summarizing this in terms of this yin yang, we're heartwarming, kumbaya, we're violent, we're terrible, we're great, we're loving, we're miserable, etc. This dichotomized nature of us, one of the ways in which we are most dichotomizing and seeing that is we are very, very nice and cooperative and self-sacrificial to individuals who on some psychological level count as an us. And we are miserable, and miserable in fractions of a second in terms of brain responses to people who are categorized as a them. And we are just like every other social primate in that regard. And the brain circuitry and the hormones of it are exactly the same. And unless you're the Dalai Lama, my conclusion is it is an inevitability, a human inevitability, a primate one, that we automatically divide the world into us and them, and we don't like the thems anywhere near as much as we like the us's. Okay, so that's depressing as hell. But at the same time, unlike every other primate out there, it's incredibly easy to manipulate us as to who counts as an us and who counts as a them. And some of that manipulation can take all of a childhood, and some of those manipulations can take a second's time, and we completely change. We've got multiple us-them categories in our heads, and context determines which one is most important to us in that instant. And like the best example I could think of that is you're walking down a deserted dark street at night, and here comes one of them. One of them, they're young, they're male, you're feeling threat, your amygdala is firing like crazy, and the certainty with which if that same individual were sitting next to you in a football stadium and you were both chanting the same idiotic song about the home team or something, you'd give your life for this brother in arms. They are and us at that moment. And we switch instantly, and for better and worse, because one of our hopes is to be taught to have more benign us them dichotomies. And one of the most clever manipulative things that dictators and ideologues can do is convince us to exaggerate us thems, and so that thems are so different they hardly even count as human.
Yeah, well, one of the lovely things you say in the book is you're talking about racism and the us and them, and as you say, it's all very depressing. And then you point out that, but you can switch us and them if the person that you regard as another race, definitely a them, puts on the same baseball cap with the same team on it, suddenly they're an us.
Yes, you recategorize it. Not even recategorize, think through, we like the same athlete, or even though we've got different worldviews, we're common ground. Your brain, your amygdala, when it sees what you classify as a them, your amygdala activates in 70 to 80 thousandths of a second, milliseconds. It is before you were even consciously aware of what you were looking at. It can be with such a rapid subliminal stimulus that you never are going to be consciously aware. Your amygdala knows. And when you are instead recategorizing, when you're flashing up a series of faces to the person in the brain scanner, and up comes the face of a them, and the amygdala activates. Now, as you say, people are wearing clothing with symbols of us's or them's of sports teams. And in 70 to 80 milliseconds, your amygdala has now completely recategorized who is an us and who is the them. I mean, some of the time you see people who do not have amygdaloid responses to other race faces. What did that require? And about 25% of people don't. They were raised in a racially diverse community. They had an intimate relationship with someone of a different race along the way. They have different us-them categories in their heads. Maybe they're the ones who have it built around the working class versus the ruling class, or some such thing. But, oh, great, good. So if we can have everybody go back to childhood and be brought up in communities where their us-thems will be benign ones. No, stick somebody in a symbol of a different us-them category to you, and it's within an instant. There's nothing inevitable about it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems particularly, that whole section of the book seems particularly relevant at the moment, because all you've got to do is, in America, stick a MAGA hat on someone and they're suddenly a them. Or
Yep.
In a conversation here, did you vote for Brexit, or will you remain? Us and them.
Yeah, instantly. And every measure indicates we are more polarized, and at a more extreme of, we would not want our child to marry one of those with that political stance, and more at a bubble and echo chamber. Yeah, we're horribly extreme with that at this point. And, that certainly has produced some pretty dramatic and bad outcomes in my country over the last 4 years.
Related to that, but also, again, one of the great themes in the book, where you talk about how easily we are to manipulate and to influence, because all that data coming in from our surroundings. And it made me think of the role of AI and social media. I mean, given what you very eloquently argue is our real nature, do you feel that there is we need to look at the role of social media, because it is something that influences us without us realizing?
Oh, I think it's hugely important, and not only because it's technologically unbelievable and all of that, but there are such damn smart people working in Silicon Valley, not far from where I sit, whose job it is to figure out how to influence people's behaviors. And they are thinking on every smart, non-dogmatic level you could possibly hope for, and taking all those lessons and using it to change how we think. I mean, a lot of the time, the purpose of that is to manipulate us into buying some sort of crap that we don't really need. And that's much of what they're being paid for. But some of the time, it's for much more fundamental things. And there's It's very worrisome stuff. At the same time, before I go off on some Luddite screed here about like the dangers of all of this, as we sit here and say, oh, it has such a powerful influence over us because of how vivid of a technology it is, and online violence can be so warping of our children. People were having the exact same conversations about television and movies 50 years ago. And no doubt they were having it 100 years ago about radio. And no doubt, I don't know, 8,000 years ago, they were having it about this weird thing that you could put like information down on a parchment or something, and you could change the behavior of somebody at the other end of your hamlet. And they don't even, writing can do that. And from day one, there's been the fear of it being overly influential. And whether it's studies of TV violence, movie violence, or now online video violence, you always get the same answer, which is violence like that makes everybody transiently more aggressive. But in terms of real long-term effects, it makes aggressive people more aggressive. Context dependency. It depends. Are you somebody who is already leaning in that direction? And what it does is it legitimizes and desensitizes and habituates and all of that. And that's been the lesson since the first studies in the 1950s about how television was going to produce nothing but sociopaths, because there were detective stories in which like a bank robber held a pistol at some point in the bank. Oh my God, the impact that's going to have. And it's the same thing over and over. It's what you bring to it. Which usually means if you have come to that point in your life from all sorts of lousy adversity and ways of learning that the world is not safe, etc., you're going to be the kind of person who's influenced.
One of the other things that you tackle, and as I say in the book, you tackle almost all of the really difficult, vexed political questions which most scientists run a mile from. And one of them is you don't shy away from saying, look, the effects of deprivation or trauma in childhood is just not something that you can say, oh, well, it's not going to worry. You know, everyone can be anything they want to be equally. And you say, well, look, you might aspire to be anything, but I mean, it's a bit like plants. You know, we're all happy with the idea that if you throw one half of the seeds on a half of a garden that you've well tended, you've turned the earth and you put fertilizer in it, they're going to do better than the seeds you throw on the gravel path.
Yeah. And you'd think we'd be able to figure that one out, that generalizes beyond plant seeds. At least in a place like the United States, which is built on this horrendous mythology of anybody can be president and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and equipotentiality. And by the time you are nothing more than a fertilized egg, the different degrees of luck that those circumstances have given rise to are already beginning to shape the trajectory of where you're heading. Here's an example of it. And this is like so outrageous. People should be like rioting at the barricades and like singing songs from Les Mis. It's so like upsetting. When you are 5 years old, one of the parts of your brain that is just starting to do some really critical development is called your frontal cortex. It's the coolest part of the brain. I should have been studying that all these years instead of the hippocampus behind me. What does the frontal cortex do? It makes you do the right thing when that's the harder thing to do. Long-term planning, gratification postponement, impulse control, emotional regulation. It doesn't fully mature until we're about 25 or so. It's the last part of the brain that does it. We've got more of it than any other species, most recently evolved. It's totally amazing. And as a 5-year-old, one of the big things that's going on is you're starting that frontal cortical construction project that's going to be so predictive. By the time you are 5 years old, this is now a well-replicated finding from some superb scientists, the socioeconomic status of your parents is already a predictor of your resting stress hormone levels. Come from a poorer background, and when there's nothing stressful going on, your body is already acting as if things are moderately stressful. Moreover, by age 5, the socioeconomic status of your parents is already a predictor of how thick your frontal cortex is. directly impinged upon by those stress hormones. Already a significant predictor of the metabolic rate of your frontal cortex and how good your frontal cortex is as a 5-year-old in making you do the right thing when that's the harder thing to do, holding out for a bigger reward instead of impulsively going for it right now. And what those studies show is 5-year-olds and how good they are at that are predictors of at age 60 or not, whether or not they're going to have issues with obesity and hypertension and economic instability and all that. By age 5, if you've been stupid enough to pick the wrong womb and the wrong family to have wound up in, that is already shaping your trajectory. The notion that we are the captains of our fate is absurd.
I just want to mention to anyone listening, if you want to start sending in questions, a little bit later we'll get to them. So start typing now. If this is your chance to ask one of the cleverest people you'll ever get to listen to his opinion on something, so don't miss the opportunity. Yeah, you make a quite impassioned defense of adolescence as well. I thought.
now that I'm no longer one, okay, neurobiologically, all of adolescence could be explained by 2 facts. First is the system in your brain that's about reward and anticipation and motivation to pursue reward and sensation seeking and novelty. It's all built around this neurotransmitter dopamine, which is vastly more subtle than most people think, but nonetheless, your dopamine system is going full blast right around the time that your gonads are really getting up to speed. Your frontal cortex, as I noted, is not fully on board, not fully wired in until you're about a quarter century old. What have we just explained? This is why adolescents behave in adolescent ways. This is why it's a period of life that's about impulsivity and sensation seeking and novelty and conformity and peer influences and all those things. And neurobiologically, it makes perfect sense. It strikes me that there's 2 things that come out of that that are interesting. One is what that means is late adolescence into early adulthood is your last shot at having your frontal cortex sculpted in to the type that is going to be good at doing the right thing and the right thing that would count as the right thing in the society in which you are. And that there's a reason why this is the case. I mean, when you look at the frontal cortex, you can look at the visual cortex or the auditory cortex, and it's all roughly the same blueprint. It's 6 layers and the same types of neurons. What's the deal with the frontal cortex? Is it fancier wiring? Is it fancier neurons? Why is it a 25-year construction project? And it's not because it is more difficult to put together. It makes perfect sense why it is the last part to mature, which is you need 25 years to get good training into what counts as the right thing. What are the hypocrisies that work in your society? What are the rationalizations? What are the thou shalt not lie, but lie in this circumstance because you're going to hurt their feelings. They shall not kill. But if you kill those sorts of people, we will give you a medal and maybe even mate with you and things of that. It takes 25 years to learn what that counts as, and no genes can specify that. By definition, if the frontal cortex is the last part of your brain to come online, it is the part of your brain least shaped by your genes and most shaped by your environment. And that's really important because if we had to explain humanness and all its stripes to a baboon out there who doesn't understand what we're up to, the answer is we've got a really big frontal cortex, but it takes a long time for it to fully mature.
Yeah, I mean, it does raise the idea that the brain is far more rewirable. It's far more able to rewire itself than we used to think sort of 50 years ago when it was set. Whereas that the brain is very much more able to shift its attention and rewire itself than we used to think.
Incredibly fast. here's one example. It's this whole new field that is incredibly trendy, neuroplasticity. The brain can rewire itself. The brain could change in response to experience. Totally cool and exciting. People are figuring out just how it works. Here's one example of the speed of it, which is like you take volunteers for a study and they agree to be blindfolded for a week and try to navigate the world as if they are blind. And what's one of the things we think of if you lose one of your sensory modalities, the other ones become more acute. So you can show after a week that there has been rewiring in the brain so that the auditory cortex has expanded its territory and is working more acutely. Like the, ooh, you get really sensitive to sounds, you have rewired the circuitry. An example that is a different time span, but which is flabbergasting, you take somebody who was born deaf, for example, and their first language, at least in the United States, is American Sign Language, British Sign Language as well. And these are languages by every linguistic and biological rule out there. You get someone whose native language is a sign language. So you sit them down, you stick them in a brain scanner, and you take a hearing person in a brain scanner and you wiggle your fingers at them, and their visual cortex activates. Makes sense. You take this congenitally deaf individual and you wiggle your fingers randomly at them and their visual cortex activates. And now you sign to them in sign language and their auditory cortex activates. What the hell is that? For one thing, it tells you language is not about sounds. Languages is about sort of abstractions. But you look where the visual cortex is and the auditory cortex, and they're 18 counties away from each other. And somewhere along the way, that neurobiology was malleable enough to figure out, hey, let's send a whole bunch of projections that are normally telling that fingers are wiggling in a certain way, but they have meaning now, and meaning that is best decoded all the hell way over in that part of the brain and the auditory cortex. It's totally crazy. And you get a person who is fluent in sign language as their first language, and years, decades later, they have stroke damage to the language centers for auditory comprehension and language, and they can't understand sign language anymore. So we have incredible brain plasticity. Critically, though, amid all that excitement, the brain can heal itself, blah, blah, all of that, is neuroplasticity is totally value-free. And some of the time, neuroplasticity can, in response to the right sort of experience and stimuli and breakfast nutrients and who knows what else, can wire things up so that you're really, really good at doing emergency medical treatments of people during a crisis. And some of the time, neuroplasticity of the same sort can make you really, really efficient at being like a genocidal warlord. It's value-free. What you get better at, neuroplasticity is not a great thing and not all on its own. It can backfire badly.
We still talk, and I wonder what you think about, we say there's a difference between your first language and a language you learn later. Is that true in your view?
Neurobiologically, yes, there's all sorts of developmental cutoff stages. I'm very weak on developmental stuff, especially linguistic, but there's development, an age at which you can learn a language, a foreign language, and not have an accent. And I think that's around age 12 or so. The age at which you could be equally fluent in two languages earlier in life. The age at which, if you are brought up bilingual, where both languages are equally represented in the primary language regions of the brain. I think that's the first 3-4 years or so. And what you see after that is, even if it's a second language that you become fluent with, it is not localized in the core part. It's the next layer out. And next layer out, it's not quite as centrally located. And you can even see dissociations with this then with strokes as to this part can be damaged and not this, or this and not that. You can get rare dissociations. The earlier the language, the second language comes in, the more it is of your brain's basic wiring to be equally bilingual. But it's really early.
I just wonder if if the same is true of other things that we learn, like do people have a moral first language?
Yes, that's a great way of phrasing it. And maybe a way of framing it is people who think about moral development in children. And just as there's a transition from when you first comprehend language to when you can first produce it, to when you can first like process double negatives, to when you can first detect irony, like all these linguistic, there's like an equivalent guy named Lawrence Kohlberg, Harvard in the 60s, who was king of this, at looking at the stages of moral development in kids, basically going from you do the right thing because otherwise you will get punished, to you do the right thing because there's laws and everyone else is doing it and things work better if everyone follows it, to highfalutin, you do the right thing because it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks, this is the right thing and I am willing to be punished for it. And people get to different Kohlberg stages and sort of the subtleties of that. And one basic critique of that was they work differently in different cultures, just as different languages do. And Kohlberg stage transitions work differently in different cultures because cultures have different values about morality, the same way that there's different languages. The second thing about that is this is a very cognitive picture of morality. What is the sophistication with which we think our way to deciding what is right and wrong? And a far bigger revolution in this field of sort of moral philosophy is the recognition that far more often than thinking our way to a moral stance, we feel our way to it. And we are driven by viscera, and we are driven by emotion, and we are driven by subterranean forces we're not even aware of. And very often what we label as our rational explanation for our moral stance is instead a post hoc rationalization for why the emotions make sense. And like the litmus test for that is when you get somebody sitting there who says, I can't quite put my finger on it. Don't ask, I can't quite identify, but when they do that, it's wrong, wrong, wrong. That's your measure of the extent to which emotions are running our moral decision making. And when the person 3 seconds or 3 legislative sessions later suddenly says, oh, this is why it's wrong when they do that, that's why you were looking at post hoc rationalization. And you put somebody in a brain scanner when they're making moral decisions and emotional parts of the brain are activating before cortical parts. Emotional parts are more predictive. You will manipulate the emotional level. And like the surest measure of that is when we are tired, when we have a bad taste in our mouth, when we are hungry, when we are in pain, we are less generous. We cheat more in economic games. We are less mitigating or discerning of mitigating factors in us making decisions about punishments for other people's norm violations and stuff. And we would sit there afterward and explain like which philosopher is the basis of you having decided what you did there. One classic influential study that like should bring everybody to a stop. You look at thousands of judicial decisions in a parole system. Does this person go free or go back to jail? And the single biggest predictor of what the judges decided was how many hours it had been since the judge had eaten a meal. Appear before a judge right after they've eaten. In this study, 60% chance of parole. 4 hours later, 0. And it's got to do with blood glucose and how readily the most expensive part of your brain, your frontal cortex, can do the hard job of seeing the world from somebody else's perspective. And what have they experienced that I could never have dreamed of because of my damn luck with which I was raised, blah, blah, etc. And like you look at that and the knowledge that you ask any of those judges afterward, hey, that's kind of interesting. You let that person go free on parole, but this person you sent back to jail, they're not going to talk about frontal cortical metabolic rates. They're going to talk about, you know, Immanuel Kant or who knows whatever. And far more than people used to think. And one of these great revolutions is we feel our way to our moral stances far more often than people used to think, and far more powerfully than we think our way to it. And I think what comes out of that is what has become like an immensely important soundbite for me, especially in the context of my country's last 4 years, which is you cannot reason somebody out of a stance they were not reasoned into in the first place. If you were not thinking about where the fear, the anxiety, the sense of peripheralization, the esteem issues, all of that, like that's going to explain nothing about why people are voting the way they do and why people are having the violent stances that they do. We're far more often than people used to think playing cognitive catch up with our visceral selves. And we don't even know that viscera is there much of the time.
So the lesson from that is never mind buying your teacher an apple, but if you're ever in front of a judge, buy him a sandwich.
Exactly, exactly.
A couple of questions. A whole bunch of people, and of course, they're simple questions. You should be able to answer them just a couple of seconds. Given what you say about free will, what are we going to do about the justice system and holding people responsible or not? In just a couple of seconds, please.
It makes no sense whatsoever. The very basis of the criminal justice system was made obsolete by neuroscience that was discovered in the 1850s. And all that has happened since then is it has become less and less relevant. There's this thing called the MacArthur Foundation in the United States that like funds all sorts of great research. And like 20 years ago, they asked a bunch of people, me included, for proposals, crazy ideas that nobody else would ever fund. And I wrote up something that I think I called, "Should the criminal justice system be abolished?" And they said, haha, okay, well, we asked for crazy ideas. That's very amusing. But yeah, let's start funding some research on neuro law, neuroscience and the brain, and how can we teach judges to be less afraid of biology, because that's why they became law students, because they hated biology. And how can we make juries more like informed about where biology is relevant to that? And like I went to some of those meetings and like amazing, wonderful work has come out of it. But I'm sitting there and I'm saying, no, 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 I was not being hyperbolic. The entire damn system needs to be thrown out because it makes no sense whatsoever. As but one example of this, tip of the iceberg in the United States, with our enlightened system of killing people for some of their violent crimes, 25% of the men on death row in this country have a history of concussive head trauma to their frontal cortex. And when the frontal cortex is damaged, your brakes are damaged on all sorts of social norms, and saying that that is indicative of bad values, a bad soul, anything, is like saying that a car has a bad soul if its brakes aren't working and it hits somebody. It's as mechanistic. And you have to have as mechanistic of a solution. If you can fix the broken brakes on a car, go and do that. And we're pitifully bad at fixing broken brains at this stage. And if you can't fix it, you put the car in the garage for the rest of time because it could damage people, but you don't give the car lectures about how it doesn't deserve to be able to drive around in a park on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. It's completely separate outside that realm. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's just, there's an impossible number of questions. But what you said sort of leads on to another bunch of questions, which essentially say, well, look, if you missed out on the good things in life, if you had a rotten first 25 years, what hope is there? What can that person do, or we do for that person?
There's tremendous grounds for hope. Which is what the neural plasticity is about. You take, for example, someone who has had the right kind of childhood adversity, who's had the horrible, worst kind of childhood adversity, and what they have learned at a very early age is terrible things happen. Terrible things happen over which I have no control and no predictability. And you know what? I am now going to form a view that not only did I have no control over that when that happened to me, I never have control. It is hopeless. I am helpless. And the psychology jargon for that is you have learned to be helpless from childhood trauma, all of that. And that is the building block of clinical depression. And that's where the psychology meets the neurobiology of depression. You have learned to be helpless in one context of trauma and adversity, particularly when early in life, and you have overgeneralized that into and I will always be a victim, and I will never have control, and I will always be abandoned. And then you look at what's the most effective type of psychotherapy for this, cognitive behavioral therapy. And what it does is it deconstructs your cognitive distortions. Yes, 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 they abandoned you. Yes, 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 you failed at that, but that was then. This isn't an inevitable future for you. And in fact, we're going to do exercises in basically retraining your brain to see where you do have efficacy and to see where you are loved. And when you translate the fact that that's one of the best psychotherapeutic routes for dealing with clinical depression built around that sort of background, when you are making somebody better, you have rewired their brain. You have done that neuroplasticity stuff so that they are understanding the difference between a then and an is, or a past tense and present, or they can perceive efficacy for what it was. And, that's neuroplasticity going on there. And when you look at things like, I don't know, in the United States, where over the course of a decade, we went from 20% to 60% of people deciding that gay marriage is not an aberration and in fact is okay. Like, change happens, and change happens on a biological level as the underpinning of every sort of change like that.
Thank you. There's a whole bunch of questions essentially asking about the effects of the uncertainty and the isolation that's come through COVID lockdowns, and what you think might be the effects of that, especially on children. There's umpteen questions. So I'm not reading out anyone's particular name. I'm not ignoring you people. It's just 20 people have asked similar questions. So.
I mean, it's hellish. And what COVID has taught us is the difference between risk and ambiguity. Risk, you know that if you get the polio vaccine from a gazillion studies with a gazillion subjects in it, we know that approximately 1 in every 13.1 million people getting a polio vaccine gets polio instead. You understand what the risk is, and you look at that and you reach a conclusion of, yeah, I should vaccinate my kid. Or you can look at the known risk of getting lung cancer if you smoke starting at whatever age, this amount, and you can make your judgment based on that. Yeah, don't be an idiot, don't smoke. But then along comes COVID, where we don't know the risks yet. We don't know the numbers. It's about ambiguity. And people go to pieces with ambiguity, as do lab rats. Here's how you show what ambiguity looks like. Okay, you've got a bin, and there's a whole bunch of tokens in there, and they're either black or white. There's 100 of these tokens, 50 are black and 50 are white, and you're given the opportunity to reach in there and pick out one. And if it's one color, they're going to beat you senseless and dump you in an alleyway. And if it's the other color, you're going to get gazillions of dollars. This is risk. People perceive this and people get stressed by it, but there are people who are much more likely to take the risk than others. And there's people who, in fact, get dopaminergic activation for it.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we've got, I think, 1 more minute. And then I'm not sure. I think perhaps that an iron curtain comes down. I don't want to be
okay, ambiguity. All you know is there's 100 tokens in there. At least one of them is black. At least one of them is white. Do you want to take a chance? That's ambiguity. Everybody hates it. Everybody's stress hormone levels go through the roof. That's what COVID is about. And ambiguity and stressors like that make us our most tunnel visioned as to whose care we care about. It makes us our most aggressively displacing. It makes us our most depressed, our most unempathic. Yeah, this is like a recipe for humans at our worst, what this pandemic has been about.
Robert, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. If you haven't read his book and you've got a little bit of spare time on your hands, I recommend it. Robert, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks. Likewise. Good health to everyone out there.